What if the man you called Dad your whole life turned out to be a stranger? And the day he buried his own mother, he tried to bury you too. Abigail Harper stood trembling at her grandmother's funeral, blindsided by a confession that shattered her world. A secret so raw it could tear a family apart, or stitch it back together in ways no one saw coming. Dive into this tale of betrayal, blood, and a legacy worth fighting for. Hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers to uncover more stories like this. The wind howled softly through the bare trees lining the gravel road to St. Mary's Church, a small wooden building tucked away in the Illinois countryside. Abigail Harper stood at the edge of the crowd, her coat pulled tight against the late October chill, watching as the last of the mourners shuffled past her grandmother's polished oak casket. Maggie Dawson had been the heart of their family, a tough gray-haired woman with a laugh that could fill a room and eyes that saw straight through you. Now she was gone, and Abby felt the weight of that loss pressing down on her chest like a stone. She could still hear Maggie's voice in her mind, clear as the day they'd sat together by the fireplace in the old farmhouse. "Life's a puzzle, Abby girl," she'd say, her knitting needles clicking in rhythm. "Sometimes the pieces don't fit till you flip them over and look at the other side." Abby had loved those afternoons, hot tea steaming in chipped mugs, the smell of wood smoke, and Maggie's stories about growing up on the Dawson land. It was a sprawling patch of earth, 200 acres of fields and woods, with a big red barn and a white house that creaked in the wind. That land was Maggie's pride, her legacy, and Abby had always assumed it'd be part of her future too. The service ended with a hymn, voices cracking on the high notes, and people started drifting toward their cars. Abby lingered, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face, her hazel eyes fixed on the casket. She wasn't ready to say goodbye, not yet. But then her father, Richard Dawson, caught her arm as she turned to leave. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face carved hard by years of running the family's finances. His gray suit was pristine, but his expression was colder than the autumn air. "Abigail," he said, his voice low, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "We need to talk, now." She followed him to a quiet corner of the churchyard, near a row of weathered headstones. The crowd's chatter faded behind them, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the distant caw of a crow. Richard crossed his arms, his jaw tight, and looked at her like she was a stranger. "I've been meaning to tell you this for a while," he started, pausing as if the words tasted bitter. "You're not my daughter." Abby blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "What?" "You heard me," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut. "You're not mine, not by blood, and that means you've got no claim to anything Mom left behind. The farm, the money, it's for the real Dawsons. People tied to this family by blood, not some accident of circumstance." Her mind spun, 1,000 questions crashing into each other. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice came out small, unsteady. "You're saying I'm not your kid? After 29 years, you drop this on me now? At her funeral?" Richard's eyes narrowed, unyielding. "I didn't want to make a scene, but it's time you knew. Mom's gone, and I'm not letting you waltz in and take what doesn't belong to you. I've spent my life building this family's name. You don't get to cash in on it." Abby stared at him, her hands trembling at her sides. This was the man who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd sat at the head of the table every Thanksgiving carving the turkey with that same stern look, and now he was tearing her world apart like it was nothing. She searched his face for a crack, some sign of regret, but there was none. Just cold certainty. "Well," she whispered, more to herself than to him, "why now?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the parking lot, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. Abby stood there, rooted to the spot, the wind tugging at her coat. She felt like she'd been hollowed out, like everything she'd known about herself had just been ripped away. Maggie's death was hard enough, but this This was a betrayal she couldn't wrap her head around. She started toward her car, a beat-up blue hatchback parked under a sagging oak tree, when she caught a snippet of Richard's voice drifting back on the breeze. He was on his phone, pacing near his sleek black sedan, his tone clipped and urgent. "No, don't let her see the real Will," he said. "I'll handle it. She's got no business digging into this." Abby froze, her keys dangling in her hand. The real Will? What was he hiding? Her heart pounded as she watched him climb into his car and drive off, taillights fading into the dusk. She'd always trusted him, maybe not loved him the way she'd loved Maggie, but trusted him to be who he said he was. Now, that trust was gone, replaced by a flicker of something new, determination. She slid into her driver's seat, the leather cold against her legs, and gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. If Richard thought he could erase her from this family with a few cruel words, he was wrong. Maggie had raised her to fight for what mattered, and Abby wasn't about to let that go. Not the farm, not the memories, not the truth. Whatever he was hiding, she'd find it. She'd turn over every piece of this puzzle until it fit, just like Maggie always said. The engine sputtered to life and Abby pulled onto the empty road, the church shrinking in her rearview mirror. She didn't know where to start, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Abby's headlights sliced through the darkness as she drove the winding road to Maggie's farmhouse, the only place she could think to go after Richard's bombshell. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the hum of her engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. Her mind churned, replaying his words over and over. "You're not my daughter." She'd spent her whole life calling him Dad, and now it felt like a lie she'd been too naive to see through. But if he wasn't her father, then who was? And what did he mean about the real Will? The farmhouse loomed ahead, its white siding glowing faintly under the moon. Abby parked near the porch, her boots crunching on the gravel as she stepped out. The air smelled of damp earth and hay, a scent that tugged at her heart. This was Maggie's domain, her sanctuary, and if there were answers anywhere, they'd be here. She unlocked the front door with the spare key she'd kept since she was a kid, the familiar creak welcoming her like an old friend. Inside, the house was still, every corner draped in shadows. Abby flicked on a lamp, its soft light spilling over the worn furniture, the plaid sofa where she'd napped as a child, the oak table scratched from years of family dinners. She wandered to the fireplace, running her fingers along the mantel where Maggie's knitting basket still sat, needles poking out like they were waiting for her to come back. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wasn't here to cry, she was here to dig. Upstairs, the attic stairs groaned under her weight as she climbed, a flashlight clutched in one hand. The space was a maze of dusty boxes and forgotten relics. Christmas decorations, old clothes, a cracked rocking horse. Abby pushed past them, her beam landing on a small wooden chest tucked beneath a slanted beam. It was simple, no lock, just a brass latch dulled by time. Her pulse quickened as she knelt and lifted the lid. Inside were papers, yellowed and fragile, tied with a faded red ribbon. She untied it carefully, her breath shallow. The first was a letter, the handwriting unmistakably her mother's, Susan's looping cursive, always a little shaky. Abby's hands trembled as she unfolded it, the date at the top marking it from 30 years ago, just before she was born. "Maggie," it began, "I don't know how to tell you this, so I'll just write it plain. I'm pregnant. It's not Richard's. I loved someone else. Someone I can't have. And now I'm scared. He doesn't know yet, and I don't think I can tell him. Please don't hate me. I need you to understand." Abby's stomach dropped. She read it again, then a third time, the words sinking in like stones. Her mother had been with someone else. Richard wasn't lying, not about that part at least. But who was this other man? Susan hadn't named him, and the letter ended abruptly, like she'd run out of courage mid-sentence. Abby set it aside, digging deeper into the chest. There were tax records, a deed to the farm, nothing else that helped. until her fingers brushed a photograph at the bottom. It was small, edges curling, showing 3 people standing in front of the barn. Maggie, young and smiling, Susan with her hair in a loose braid, and a man Abby didn't recognize at first. He was tall, lean, with sandy hair and a shy grin. She flipped it over, and her breath caught. Scrawled in Maggie's sharp handwriting were the words, "My real family, 1989. She looked closer at the man. There was something familiar in his eyes, something she couldn't place until it hit her. He looked like Henry, her uncle, Richard's younger brother. Her mind raced. Henry? Quiet, gentle Henry, who fixed cars in town and always brought her a candy bar when he visited? Could he be the one? She shoved the photo into her pocket and drove straight to her mom's house, a modest brick place 20 minutes away. Susan answered the door in a robe, her graying hair pulled back, her face paling when she saw Abby's expression. "We need to talk," Abby said, stepping inside before Susan could protest. The living room smelled of lavender and old books, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in her chest. "I found a letter. You wrote it to Grandma. You said I wasn't Richard's. Tell me the truth, Mom. Who's my father?" Susan sank onto the couch, her hands twisting in her lap. "Oh, honey," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted you to find out like this." "Then how was I supposed to find out?" Abby snapped, pacing the room. "When Dad, Richard, told me I'm not his at Grandma's funeral, when he said I don't belong in this family." Susan's eyes widened. "He told you that?" "Yeah, he did, so start talking." Her mother took a shaky breath, staring at the floor. "It's true. Richard's not your father. I was in love with someone else before I married him. But Richard, he made it impossible. He had money, control, and I was young and scared. I let him take me away from the man I really loved. That's all I'll say. I won't drag him into this now." Abby clenched her fists. "You owe me a name, Mom." Susan shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't. Not yet." Frustrated, Abby stormed out, driving next to Henry's garage on the edge of town. The lights were still on, and she found him under a truck, grease smeared on his overalls. He slid out when he saw her, wiping his hands on a rag, his kind brown eyes crinkling with a smile. "Hey, kiddo, what brings you here so late?" She didn't waste time. "Henry, did you ever notice how much Grandma loved me? More than Richard, maybe." He chuckled, leaning against the workbench. "Oh, sure. She always said you were special. Used to drive Richard nuts, how she'd light up around you. He's been jealous of that since you were little." Abby's heart thudded. "She ever say why?" Henry shrugged, but his gaze flickered, like he was holding something back. "Just that blood doesn't always mean what folks think it does. Maggie had her own way of seeing family." She pulled the photo from her pocket, holding it out. "Then explain this." Henry's smile faded as he took it, his fingers brushing the edges. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at her, his face pale. "Where'd you get this?" "Grandma's attic," she said, her voice steady, "and I think you owe me some answers too." Henry's garage felt smaller all of a sudden, the air thick with the smell of motor oil and the weight of unspoken words. Abby stood there, the photo trembling slightly in her hand as she watched him. His face had gone from warm and familiar to something else. Pale, guarded, like a man caught in a trap he'd spent years avoiding. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp shadows across the concrete floor. "Henry," she said, her voice firm despite the knot in her stomach, "tell me what's going on. That picture, Grandma called you and Mom her real family, and then there's this letter I found where Mom said I wasn't Richard's. I need to know the truth. Are you my father?" He set the photo down on the workbench, slow and deliberate, like it might break if he moved too fast. His hands shook as he wiped them on the rag again, though they were already clean. For a long moment he didn't say anything, just stared at the picture. Young Maggie, beaming, Susan laughing, and him with that shy grin. Then he let out a breath, heavy and ragged, and looked up at her. "Yeah, Abby," he said quietly. "I'm your dad." The words hit her like a punch, stealing the air from her lungs. She'd suspected it, hoped it even, but hearing it out loud was different. It was real now, solid, and it turned everything she'd ever known upside down. She stepped back, gripping the edge of a tool cart to steady herself, her mind racing to piece it together. "How?" she managed, her voice cracking. "How did this happen?" Henry pulled a stool over and sat, his shoulders slumping like the weight of 30 years had just settled on them. "It was a long time ago," he started, his eyes distant. "Me and your mom, we were in love. High school sweethearts, the kind of thing you think lasts forever. But Richard, he was older, had money, had plans. He wanted Susan, and he didn't take no for an answer. I didn't have much back then, just a beat-up truck and a job pumping gas. He made her an offer she couldn't refuse. Or maybe he scared her into it. I don't know the whole story. All I know is she broke it off with me, and a few months later, she was married to him." Abby swallowed hard, her throat tight. "But me? When did I happen?" He gave a small, sad smile. "Right before she left me. We had one last night together. Stupid, reckless, but we couldn't help it. She didn't tell me she was pregnant, not till after she was already with Richard. By then it was too late. She said he'd never let her go if he knew, and she was right. He built a life around her, around you, like he could own you both. So we kept it quiet. Maggie knew, though. She figured it out early on." "Grandma knew?" Abby's voice rose, a mix of shock and relief washing over her. "She knew you were my father and didn't tell me?" "She wanted to protect you," Henry said, his tone soft but firm. "Richard's got a temper and he's got pride. If he'd found out back then, he might have taken it out on you or Susan. Maggie made me promise to stay quiet, let you grow up safe. But she loved you, Abby, more than anyone. She always said you were the best of us." Abby's eyes burned with tears she didn't want to let fall. She could picture Maggie now, sitting in her rocking chair, watching her with that knowing look. All those years, she'd been keeping this secret, not out of shame, but out of love. It made sense in a twisted way, but it didn't make the hurt any less sharp. "There's more," Henry said, his voice dropping lower. "Something you need to know about Richard." She wiped her face with her sleeve, bracing herself. "What?" "He's not Maggie's son, not by blood anyway. She and Dad couldn't have kids for years after they got married, so they adopted Richard from an orphanage in Chicago. I came along later, a surprise when they'd almost given up hope. I'm the only one who carries the Dawson blood. Richard's known that since he was a teenager. Overheard Mom and Dad talking about it one night. It ate at him, made him bitter. That's why he's always been so desperate to control everything, to prove he belongs." Abby's jaw dropped, her mind reeling. Richard wasn't a Dawson? The man who'd just disowned her for not being real family wasn't even part of the bloodline himself? It was almost laughable, if it didn't make her so furious. "So all this time," she said, her voice trembling with anger, "he's been lying to everyone? Acting like he's the king of this family when he's got no claim to it?" Henry nodded, his expression grim. "He's built his whole life on that lie. And when Maggie started talking about her will, about passing things down to you, he got scared. Scared you'd take what he thinks is his." Abby paced the garage, her boots scuffing the floor. The pieces were falling into place. Richard's coldness, his obsession with the farm, the way he'd snapped at her at the funeral. He wasn't just trying to cut her out, he was trying to bury a truth he couldn't face. But there was still one thing she didn't understand. "If Grandma knew all this," she said, turning back to Henry, "why didn't she do something? Why let him get away with it?" "She tried," he said. "She told me once she'd fixed it, made sure the farm would go to the right people. I didn't ask what she meant, figured it was her business. But now, with what Richard said to you, I'm guessing she put it in her will. The real one, not whatever he's trying to push through." Abby's heart skipped a beat. The real Will? She remembered his phone call, the urgency in his voice. He was hiding something, and it was bigger than she'd thought. Before she could ask more, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, squinting at the screen. A number she didn't recognize, but the voicemail icon blinked red. She hit play, holding it to her ear, and a man's voice came through, calm but insistent. "Miss Harper, this is Tom Grayson, your grandmother's attorney. I've been trying to reach you. We need you at my office as soon as possible. There's something Maggie wanted you to know before the will gets read tomorrow. It's important." Abby lowered the phone, her pulse racing. She looked at Henry, who raised an eyebrow, concern etched into his weathered face. "What is it?" he asked. She took a deep breath, the fire in her chest burning brighter. "It's time to find out what Grandma really wanted, and I'm not letting Richard stop me." The morning sun was just breaking over the horizon, painting the Illinois fields in soft gold as Abby pulled into the parking lot of Tom Grayson's law office. It was a squat brick building in town, wedged between a diner and a hardware store, the kind of place you'd drive past without a second glance. But today, it felt like the center of everything. She'd barely slept, her mind buzzing with Henry's revelations. Her real father, the man who'd been there all along, and Richard, the imposter who'd built his life on a shaky lie. Now, with Grayson's cryptic message echoing in her ears, she was ready to face whatever came next. She stepped out of her car, the gravel crunching under her boots, and smoothed her jacket. Her hands were steady, but her heart thumped hard against her ribs. Henry had offered to come with her, but she'd told him no. This was something she needed to do alone. At least for now. She pushed through the glass door, a bell jingling above her head, and found herself in a small waiting room that smelled of coffee and old paper. Tom Grayson greeted her with a handshake, his grip firm but warm. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and a pair of glasses perched on his nose. "Abigail," he said, his voice smooth as he led her to his office. "Thanks for coming so quick. I've been trying to track you down since Maggie passed." "I got your message," she said, settling into a chair across from his desk. "You said there's something I need to know?" He nodded, pulling a thick folder from a drawer. "That's right. But before we get into it, I should warn you, Richard's here too. He insisted on being present when the will's read. Said it's his right as Maggie's son." Abby's stomach twisted, but she kept her face calm. "Let him stay. I've got nothing to hide." Grayson raised an eyebrow, like he wasn't sure she meant it, but he didn't argue. A moment later, the door swung open, and Richard strode in, his suit crisp and his expression smug. He didn't look at Abby, just took the chair beside her like he owned the room. The air between them crackled, thick with everything unsaid since the funeral. "Let's get this over with," Richard said, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "I've got a busy day." Grayson cleared his throat, unfazed, and opened the folder. "All right then, this is Margaret Dawson's last will and testament, signed and notarized 2 years ago. She was very clear about her wishes, and she left specific instructions for today." He pulled out a sealed envelope, breaking the wax with a small knife, and unfolded the document inside. His eyes scanned the page before he began reading aloud. "To my family," he started, his voice steady. "I've lived a long life, and I've seen what matters most. This farm, this land, it's more than dirt and dollars, it's a legacy. And I want it to go to the people who carry the Dawson blood, the ones who've got the heart to keep it alive. That's why I leave the entirety of my estate, the house, the land, the savings, to my granddaughter, Abigail Harper, and my son, Henry Dawson, in equal shares. They're the true Dawsons, by blood and by spirit." Abby's breath caught, a rush of warmth flooding her chest. She glanced at Richard, whose face had gone rigid, his knuckles whitening on the chair. Grayson kept reading. "To Richard," he continued, "I leave my gratitude for the years you called me Mom. You were a son to me in every way that mattered, but not by blood. I know you've known that truth longer than I ever admitted. I hope you find peace with it." Richard shot to his feet, his chair scraping the floor. "This is bullshit. he shouted, his voice bouncing off the walls. "She can't do this. She can't cut me out like I'm nothing. I'm her son, damn it. I've run this family for decades." Abby stood too, her hands clenched at her sides. "You're not her son," she said, her voice low but cutting. "You've known that all along, haven't you? And you still had the nerve to tell me I don't belong." He whirled on her, his eyes blazing. "You're a nobody, Abigail. Some bastard kid trying to steal what's mine. You think you can waltz in here with your sob story and take everything?" "Enough," Grayson snapped, slamming the folder shut. "Sit down, both of you, or I'll have you escorted out." "There's more." Richard glared but sank back into his seat, his chest heaving. Abby stayed standing, her pulse pounding in her ears. Grayson pulled a second sheet from the envelope, his expression softening. "Maggie had me run DNA tests," he said, "years ago when Abby was still a teenager. She wanted proof, something solid, in case this day ever came. The results are here. Henry Dawson is Abigail's biological father, and Richard, you're not a genetic match to Maggie or her late husband. She kept it quiet to spare your feelings, but she made sure her wishes were ironclad." Richard's face crumpled, the fight draining out of him. He stared at the desk, his hands limp in his lap, like a man who'd just lost a war he'd been waging his whole life. Abby watched him, her anger fading into something closer to pity. He'd built his identity on a foundation of sand, and now it was washing away. She turned to Grayson. "So that's it? The farm's mine and Henry's?" "That's it," he said, sliding the papers across the desk. "It's yours, legally and fully. Richard can contest it if he wants, but he won't win. Maggie knew what she was doing." Abby nodded, a weight lifting off her shoulders. She'd come here expecting a fight, but she'd gotten more truth, justice, a piece of Maggie's heart handed down to her. She looked at Richard one last time. "You spent your life lying to everyone," she said quietly. "I just wanted to know who I really am." He didn't respond, just stood and walked out, the door banging shut behind him. Abby sank back into her chair, her legs shaky, but her mind clear. Grayson gave her a small smile. "Maggie was proud of you, you know. She talked about you all the time." Tears pricked her eyes, but she smiled back. "I'm starting to see why." Her phone buzzed again. Henry this time, his name lighting up the screen. She answered, her voice steady. "Hey, Dad." "How'd it go?" he asked, his tone anxious. "It's ours," she said, a laugh breaking through. "The farm, everything. She gave it to us." There was a pause, then a choked sound, like he was holding back tears of his own. "Good. That's real good, Abby. But listen, there's one more thing. Mom left something for you at the house. I think we should check it out together." She gripped the phone tighter, her heart swelling. "I'll meet you there." The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the Dawson farm as Abby pulled up beside Henry's old pickup truck. The red barn glowed in the light, and the fields stretched out like a patchwork quilt, golden and green under the October haze. She stepped out, the air cool against her skin, and found Henry waiting on the porch, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. He looked different now. Still the same quiet man she'd always known, but there was a softness in his eyes, a pride she hadn't noticed before. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You ready for this?" Abby nodded, climbing the steps to stand beside him. "Yeah, let's see what Grandma left us." They pushed through the front door together, the familiar creak of the hinges welcoming them home. The house felt alive again, not just a shell of memories, but a place with a future. Abby's boots echoed on the hardwood as they moved past the living room, past the fireplace where Maggie's knitting basket still sat, and into the small den at the back. It was Maggie's favorite spot, a cozy room with a big window overlooking the fields, a faded armchair, and a bookshelf stuffed with novels and photo albums. Henry knelt by the chair, running his hand along the base until he found a loose floorboard. "She told me about this a while back," he said, prying it up with a grunt. said she'd hidden something special just for you. Abby crouched beside him, her heart thudding as he lifted the board. Beneath it was a small metal box, rusted at the edges but intact, with a simple latch. Henry handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers. "Go on," he said. "It's yours." She flipped the latch and opened it, the hinges squeaking faintly. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth from years of handling, and a folded piece of paper tucked into the front. Abby pulled the paper out first, unfolding it to reveal Maggie's sharp, slanted handwriting. "Abby," she read aloud, her voice trembling, "if you're reading this, it means you've found your way to the truth. I'm proud of you, girl, prouder than you'll ever know. I spent my life trying to keep this family together, but I made mistakes along the way. I let Richard believe he was more than he was, and I let Henry and Susan lose what they had. But you're the best thing to come out of it all. This farm's yours now, yours and your dad's, because you've got the Dawson heart. Use it well. Love, Grandma." Tears spilled down Abby's cheeks, hot and fast, and she didn't bother wiping them away. She handed the note to Henry, who read it silently, his own eyes glistening. "She always knew how to say it," he murmured, folding it back up. Abby turned to the journal, flipping it open. The pages were filled with Maggie's words, stories of the farm, sketches of the land, little notes about her life. But the last entry, dated a month before she died, stopped her cold. "Abby's got a fire in her," it read. "She'll fight for what's right, even when it's hard. I wish I'd told her sooner who she really is, but I trust she'll figure it out. This place isn't just land, it's a chance to build something new. I hope she sees that." Henry rested a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "She saw you, Abby. All of you." She closed the journal, clutching it to her chest, and stood, walking to the window. The fields rolled out before her, endless and alive, and for the first time since Maggie's death, she felt whole. Richard's betrayal, the years of secrets, they'd hurt, but they'd led her here, to this moment, to this truth. She wasn't just Maggie's granddaughter or Henry's daughter. She was part of something bigger, something worth holding on to. "I've been thinking," she said, turning to Henry. "This farm, it's too good to just sit here. What if we turned it into something more? A place for people to come together. Kids could learn about farming. Old folks could share their stories, like a community, you know? Grandma would have loved that." Henry's face lit up, a slow grin spreading across it. "Yeah, she would have. And I'd like that too. Been a while since I had something to work on with my hands and my heart." They spent the next hour talking it over, tossing ideas back and forth, planting a garden, fixing up the barn, maybe even hosting a harvest festival. It wasn't just a plan, it was a promise, a way to keep Maggie's spirit alive. Henry started coming around more after that, trading his garage shifts for mornings at the farm, hammering nails and hauling hay with Abby by his side. They laughed more than they ever had, rebuilding a bond they'd lost before it even started. One evening, a week later, Abby stood alone in the field, the sky streaked with pink and orange as the sun dipped below the trees. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the faint scent of earth and possibility. She thought about Maggie, about the woman who'd fought quietly for her all those years, and about Henry, the father she'd finally found. Richard was out there somewhere, probably licking his wounds, but he didn't matter anymore. He'd tried to take this from her, but he'd failed. She pulled the journal from her pocket, running her thumb over the cover. "Thanks, Grandma," she whispered, her voice catching on the breeze. "I'll make you proud." The stars were just starting to peek out, tiny pinpricks of light against the deepening blue. Abby took a deep breath, feeling the ground solid beneath her feet, and smiled. This was her place now, hers and Henry's, and it was only the beginning. Family wasn't just what you were born into, it was what you fought for, what you built, and she was ready to build something beautiful.